The ground beneath Wyoming sits on top of a magma chamber 55 miles wide and 20 miles deep. Right now in 2025, scientists are monitoring this geological feature that dwarfs anything in recorded history. While the odds of an eruption remain extremely low, about 1 in 730,000 per year, the potential consequences would be staggering. Current atmospheric models show that measurable ash fall would blanket much of the western United States within days of an eruption. To put this in perspective, the 1991 Mount Pinatubo eruption cooled global temperatures for years. Yet Yellowstone's magma chamber is hundreds of times larger. The scale of what lies beneath Wyoming defies comprehension. The monster beneath Wyoming. What scientists have discovered through advanced imaging reveals two distinct magma chambers working as a connected system. The upper chamber spans 46 miles by 28 miles, extending from 3 to 10 miles beneath the surface. This shallower reservoir contains mostly solid rock with only 5 to 15% actual melt. But that small percentage still represents an enormous volume of molten material. Below this sits a much larger chamber, stretching down to 28 miles deep and containing approximately 5 times more magma than the upper system. Most people think of Mount St. Helens when they picture volcanic eruptions. That mountain blew apart in 1980 and made headlines around the world. But comparing Mount St. Helens to Yellowstone misses the true scale entirely. Mount Pinatubo in 1991 ejected roughly 1 cubic kilometer of material and cooled global temperatures by 0.7 degrees Celsius for several years. Yellowstone's previous eruptions expelled more than 1,000 cubic kilometers of material, making them over 1,000 times larger than Pinatubo. When volcanologists classify eruptions on the Volcanic Explosivity Index, regular volcanoes max out around level 5 or 6. Yellowstone would register as a level 8, the highest classification that exists. The Yellowstone caldera formed through a process that reshaped the entire region. Instead of building up like traditional volcanoes, supervolcanoes collapse inward after they erupt. The ground literally falls into the emptied magma chamber, creating a massive circular depression. This caldera measures 30 miles across and 45 miles long. You could fit the entire city of Chicago inside it with space left over. Most visitors to Yellowstone National Park never realize they're standing inside the crater of an active supervolcano. Scientists have identified 3 major eruption cycles that created the landscape we see today. The Huckleberry Ridge eruption occurred 2.1 million years ago and ejected 590 cubic miles of material. The Mesa Falls eruption happened 1.3 million years ago and was smaller but still catastrophic. The most recent Lava Creek eruption took place 640,000 years ago and created the current caldera. Each eruption followed roughly the same pattern: massive buildup of pressure followed by catastrophic release. Current geological surveys using 2025 technology reveal details that previous generations of scientists could never access. Seismic imaging shows the magma chamber extends much deeper than originally thought. Recent magnetotelluric surveys map the electrical conductivity of underground structures, revealing molten rock pathways that connect these chambers. The data shows an active system where magma and hydrothermal fluids continue circulating through complex underground networks. Ground deformation patterns show the caldera has been rising and falling in measurable cycles. Between 1976 and 1984, the ground rose nearly 6 inches. From 1985 to 1995, it dropped by the same amount. Then from 1996 to 2003, it rose again by about 5 inches before leveling off. Since 2014, new uplift patterns have emerged in different areas of the caldera. The Sour Creek Dome has risen 2.4 inches since 2015, while the Mallard Lake Dome shows different movement patterns entirely. Modern monitoring equipment detects changes that would have been invisible just decades ago. A network of 47 seismometers records every tiny earthquake in a region. These instruments can detect ground movements smaller than the width of a human hair. GPS stations measure ground deformation with millimeter precision. Temperature sensors monitor hot springs and geysers for thermal changes that might indicate shifting magma patterns below. earthquake swarms provide some of the most telling data about what's happening underground. In 2017, researchers recorded over 2,300 earthquakes in the Yellowstone region, the most active year since monitoring began. Most of these earthquakes measured between magnitude 0 and 2, too small for people to feel, but significant for scientific analysis. The patterns show magma and hydrothermal fluids moving through underground fractures and chambers. Gas emissions from the park's thermal features reveal chemical signatures of the magma below. Helium isotope ratios indicate direct connections between surface hot springs and the deep magma chamber. Carbon dioxide output has increased measurably in certain areas over the past decade. These gases escape through the same pathways that would channel magma during an eruption. Warning signs before a major eruption would likely begin months or years in advance. The earthquake activity would intensify dramatically, with thousands of tremors per day instead of the current few dozen. Ground deformation would accelerate, potentially lifting the caldera floor by several feet per year. Thermal features throughout the park would change temperature and chemical composition as new magma approached the surface. New lakes might form as rising magma heats groundwater systems. Existing geysers could stop erupting or change their patterns completely. The famous Old Faithful geyser has already shown timing changes over the decades, erupting every 44 to 125 minutes, depending on previous eruption duration and underground conditions. Trees and vegetation would begin dying in expanding zones as underground temperatures increase and soil chemistry changes. The United States Geological Survey operates the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory specifically to monitor this threat. Scientists analyze data streams 24 hours a day, looking for patterns that might indicate changing conditions below ground. Computer models process seismic data, ground deformation measurements, and gas emission readings to assess current risk levels. Current probability assessments put the chance of a major Yellowstone eruption at roughly 1 in 730,000 in any given year. Those odds might seem reassuring, but they represent active calculations based on ongoing monitoring. The volcano shows clear signs of life. It's not extinct or dormant in any meaningful sense. Magma continues circulating through the chamber system. Thermal features continue drawing heat from deep underground sources. The monitoring systems reveal a dynamic, active geological system that could potentially change rapidly under the right conditions. While scientists can't predict exactly when or if an eruption might occur, they can measure the ongoing processes that would precede such an event. The technology now exists to detect the warning signs months or even years before catastrophe strikes. But all this sophisticated monitoring equipment would become irrelevant the moment the mountain finally decides to explode. The first 72 hours of chaos. The moment of eruption creates devastation on a scale that defies human comprehension. A 100-mile blast zone would devastate towns within the caldera boundary, creating a circle of complete destruction spanning 31,400 square miles. Pyroclastic flows race outward at speeds up to 450 miles per hour, carrying superheated gas, rock, and ash at temperatures exceeding 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. These flows move faster than commercial aircraft and obliterate everything in their path. Concrete melts, steel collapses, and vehicles vaporize before their occupants can react. The initial explosion sends shockwaves racing outward at the speed of sound. Windows shatter in buildings 200 miles away as the blast wave levels forests across thousands of square miles. Within minutes, the eruption column shoots 25 miles into the atmosphere, punching through the stratosphere and spreading volcanic material across vast distances. The electromagnetic pulse generated by massive electrical activity in the ash cloud disrupts communications, while modern monitoring systems face simultaneous failures as cell towers topple. Fiber optic cables suffer seismic damage, and emergency services lose contact with field units across the western United States. Current atmospheric models show ash fall patterns extending across 11 western states within the first 24 hours. Wind patterns typically carry volcanic ash eastward from Yellowstone, creating a cascade of destruction that spreads far beyond the initial blast zone. Wyoming experiences ash deposits 3 feet deep within 100 miles of the eruption. Montana's agricultural regions receive 6 to 12 inches of ash, making roads impassable and collapsing roofs across major cities. Denver sits 450 miles southeast of Yellowstone, and the city's 2.9 million residents watch the sky darken within 18 hours as ash clouds block out the sun. Even with advance warning, evacuating nearly 3 million people proves logistically impossible. Interstate highways become parking lots as vehicles break down from ash ingestion. Denver International Airport closes before the first ash arrives, stranding thousands of travelers. Salt Lake City faces a uniquely dangerous scenario. The city's 1.2 million residents live in a valley that traps volcanic ash like a bowl. The Wasatch Mountains channel ash flows directly into populated areas, and the city's geography means ash accumulates to dangerous depths even with relatively light initial deposits. Roofs collapse under the weight while the Great Salt Lake turns gray with volcanic debris. Interstate highways transform into death traps within hours of the eruption. Interstate 15 runs directly through the projected ash fall zone from Salt Lake City to Las Vegas. Truckers and travelers find their vehicles disabled as ash clogs air filters and damages engines. Interstate 80 across Wyoming becomes impassable as visibility drops to zero and ash makes roadways slippery and treacherous. Millions of people attempt to flee simultaneously, creating the largest traffic jam in American history. Gas stations run out of fuel within hours as panicked drivers top off their tanks. Store shelves empty as people grab water, food, and supplies. Banks face runs as people try to withdraw cash, but ATM networks fail due to power outages and communication breakdowns. Portland, Oregon, and Seattle, Washington face their own crisis as ash clouds drift westward on changing wind patterns. Both cities combined house 3.8 million people in their metropolitan areas. Ash falling on the wet Pacific Northwest creates concrete-like sludge that blocks storm drains and makes streets impassable. The region's numerous bridges become bottlenecks as people try to evacuate by car. Hospitals throughout the western United States are overwhelmed within hours. Respiratory emergencies spike as people breathe ash-contaminated air. Emergency rooms from Rapid City, South Dakota to Phoenix, Arizona see massive increases in patients suffering from silicosis, eye injuries, and breathing difficulties. Medical supply chains break down as transportation networks fail. Power grids across multiple states face cascading failures. Ash accumulation on power lines causes electrical shorts and fires. Windstorms generated by the eruption topple transmission towers. Coal-fired power plants cannot operate when ash contaminates their fuel supplies. Nuclear power plants shut down as safety systems activate to prevent ash from clogging cooling systems. Water treatment facilities struggle to process ash-contaminated supplies. Cities drawing water from rivers and reservoirs face immediate contamination issues. Municipal water systems shut down rather than risk poisoning their populations. Bottled water disappears from store shelves within hours, leaving millions without safe drinking water. The chaos extends far beyond the immediate ashfall zone. Stock markets crash as news of the eruption spreads globally. International flights avoid North American airspace entirely. Cruise ships change course to avoid West Coast ports. The ripple effects reach every corner of the continent within 72 hours. Even cities 500 miles from Yellowstone face immediate threats. Chicago's 9.5 million residents would experience ash fall within 36 to 48 hours if wind patterns shift eastward. The city's airports close preemptively, while Lake Michigan shows visible ash contamination. The entire Great Lakes region prepares for extended ash fall as the volcanic cloud continues spreading. By the end of the third day, the full scope of the disaster becomes clear. What began as a geological event in a remote corner of Wyoming has transformed into a continental crisis. Emergency services struggle to coordinate responses across multiple states. Communication networks remain largely inoperable. Transportation systems have ground to a halt. And this represents only the beginning of what scientists predict will be months or years of unprecedented challenges as the ash cloud continues its relentless march across the continent. When the sky turns black, ashfall in the following days would shut down power grids across multiple states, as particulate buildup on lines and substations induces short circuits, as documented in Pinatubo's 1991 aftermath. The ash cloud stretches from the Rocky Mountains to the Mississippi River, covering 22 states in a gray blanket that turns day into night. Cities like Minneapolis, Kansas City, and Oklahoma City experience total darkness at noon. Street lights activate automatically as sensors detect the absence of sunlight. The ash cloud moves at 60 miles per hour, carried by jet stream winds that push the debris eastward across the Great Plains. Just 3 inches of ash brings down residential roofs across Nebraska and Iowa. The weight equals 15 pounds per square foot when dry, but doubles when mixed with rain or snow. Suburban homes built to standard codes can't handle the additional load. Shopping centers collapse in Lincoln, Nebraska, as ash accumulates on flat commercial roofs. Mobile homes become death traps as their lightweight construction fails under even lighter ash deposits. Entire neighborhoods in Omaha evacuate as roofs cave in throughout the metropolitan area. Roads become impassable death traps as ash creates conditions worse than the heaviest snowstorms. Interstate 80 across Nebraska closes completely as visibility drops to zero. The ash creates a slippery surface that makes driving impossible even at low speeds. Highway crews can't clear the roads fast enough as new ash continues falling. Emergency vehicles get stuck trying to reach accident scenes. Snowplows break down as the abrasive ash damages their equipment. State transportation departments run out of sand and salt within hours of the ash fall beginning. Respiratory emergencies overwhelm hospitals from Denver to Detroit as 50 million Americans struggle to breathe through ash-contaminated air. The particles measure less than 2.5 microns in diameter, small enough to penetrate deep into lung tissue. Emergency rooms in Kansas City receive 400 patients per hour with breathing difficulties. Doctors run out of inhalers and oxygen tanks within the first day. Patients with existing asthma and COPD face life-threatening complications as their airways become inflamed and blocked. Children and elderly people suffer the most severe health impacts from ash inhalation. Pediatric hospitals in Minneapolis and St. Louis activate emergency protocols as young patients arrive with respiratory distress. The ash particles cause chemical burns in lung tissue, leading to permanent scarring in severe cases. Pregnant women face additional risks, as the stress and poor air quality threaten both mother and child. Nursing homes struggle to protect their residents, as standard air filtration systems can't handle the microscopic particles. Water treatment plants across the Midwest shut down as ash contaminates their intake systems. The Missouri River turns gray with volcanic debris, making it impossible to process for drinking water. Cities drawing from the Mississippi River face similar contamination issues as ash-laden runoff flows downstream. St. Louis water treatment facilities close after detecting dangerous levels of fluoride and heavy metals in the ash-contaminated supply. Chicago prepares for water shortages as Lake Michigan shows visible ash contamination along its western shores. Municipal water systems in affected areas stop operation rather than risk poisoning their populations. Kansas City's water treatment plant processes 300 million gallons daily, but can't remove the fine volcanic particles effectively. The ash clogs filters and damages pumping equipment, forcing emergency shutdowns. Rural communities dependent on well water face immediate contamination as ash seeps into groundwater supplies. Livestock across the Great Plains die from drinking ash-contaminated water, creating additional health hazards. Hospitals face cascading failures as their infrastructure collapses under the ash assault. Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota activates emergency power systems as ash accumulation shorts out electrical equipment. Ventilation systems designed to filter normal air can't handle the volume of volcanic particles. Operating rooms become unusable as ash infiltrates supposedly sterile environments. Medical helicopters can't fly in the ash cloud conditions. cutting off critical care transport for rural patients. Communication towers topple under the weight of ash accumulation and ice formation. Cell phone networks fail across the affected region as towers lose power and structural integrity. Internet service providers struggle to maintain connections as fiber optic cables suffer damage from falling debris. Emergency broadcast systems go silent in many areas as radio towers collapse. Satellite communications face interference from the ash cloud in the upper atmosphere. Vehicle engines fail by the thousands as ash clogs air filters and damages internal components. Cars abandoned on highways become obstacles for emergency vehicles trying to navigate the disaster zone. Ash particles enter engines through intake systems, causing immediate mechanical failure. Diesel trucks fare slightly better, but still suffer engine damage from the abrasive particles. Aircraft engines face catastrophic failure if exposed to volcanic ash, grounding all air traffic across the affected region. Commercial aviation shuts down completely across the central United States as ash clouds make flying impossible. Chicago O'Hare International Airport closes indefinitely as ash covers runways and damages ground equipment. Delta Airlines cancels 2,000 flights as aircraft can't safely operate in ash-contaminated airspace. Cargo flights carrying emergency supplies can't reach affected areas, worsening the humanitarian crisis. Military aircraft attempt rescue operations, but face the same engine damage risks as civilian planes. The psychological impact of prolonged darkness devastates millions of Americans unprepared for this ancient terror. Residents of Kansas City experience their first sunless day in recorded history as ash blocks 95% of solar radiation. Seasonal affective disorder cases spike as people struggle with the artificial winter conditions. Suicide hotlines receive record numbers of calls as the darkness triggers depression and anxiety. Children ask their parents when the sun will return, but adults have no answers. The ash. Fall creates conditions unlike anything in recorded American history, surpassing even the Dust Bowl of the 1930s in scope and severity. Modern infrastructure designed for normal weather conditions fails catastrophically under the volcanic assault. The combination of respiratory health crises, infrastructure collapse, and prolonged darkness creates a perfect storm of human suffering. Recovery efforts can't begin until the ash stops falling, but volcanic eruptions can continue for months or years. Yet even as cities struggle with immediate survival, the volcanic ash settles across America's most productive agricultural regions, threatening the foundation of the nation's food supply. The death of American agriculture. Corn and soybean fields across the Midwest face immediate destruction as volcanic ash blankets America's agricultural heartland. The region produces 40% of the world's corn and 38% of global soybean production across 127 million acres of prime farmland. Iowa alone generates 2.5 billion bushels of corn annually from 13.1 million acres. Illinois contributes another 2.1 billion bushels from 11.2 million acres. Nebraska adds 1.7 billion bushels from 9.6 million acres of corn production. These three states combined feed 2 billion people worldwide through direct consumption and livestock feed conversion. Historical models from the 1991 Mount Pinatubo eruption show corn yields in the U.S. Midwest drop significantly in the first post-eruption season due to reduced sunlight and altered growing conditions. Yellowstone's ash would create far more severe impacts given the volume and proximity to agricultural regions. Volcanic ash particles contain sharp, glass-like fragments that slice through plant tissue while blocking sunlight essential for photosynthesis. Corn plants exposed to even moderate ash accumulation suffer complete leaf burn and stem collapse within days. Soybean fields experience similar destruction as ash particles block stomata and prevent normal plant functions. Soil acidification occurs rapidly as volcanic ash alters pH levels from neutral to highly acidic conditions. The chemical composition includes compounds that make soil unsuitable for most crops, creating conditions documented in previous volcanic events. Heavy metals leach from ash deposits into soil systems, concentrating at dangerous levels that persist for years after the initial eruption. These toxins remain in agricultural soils long after ash removal efforts, making farmland unusable for extended periods. Livestock populations face immediate mortality as fine ash particles clog respiratory systems. Dairy cattle across Wisconsin and Minnesota begin dying within hours of exposure as volcanic ash causes permanent lung damage and fluid buildup. The state's 1.3 million dairy cows produce 30.6 billion pounds of milk annually, but ash contamination threatens the majority of herds in affected areas. Surviving cattle suffer from consuming ash-contaminated feed, leading to digestive complications and eventual death. Swine operations in Iowa house 24.6 million pigs that generate 7.7 billion pounds of pork annually for domestic and international markets. Pigs prove extremely vulnerable to ash inhalation due to their sensitive respiratory systems. Volcanic ash triggers severe pneumonia in swine populations, with high mortality rates in areas receiving significant ashfall. Contaminated feed containing volcanic particles causes internal injuries in animals that survive the initial respiratory crisis. Poultry farms across the Midwest lose entire flocks as chickens and turkeys suffocate from ash inhalation. Iowa's 60 million laying hens produce 16.2 billion eggs annually, but volcanic ash infiltrates ventilation systems designed for normal air filtration. The microscopic ash particles bypass standard filters and accumulate in bird respiratory systems, causing mass die-offs within hours of initial exposure. Egg production stops completely as surviving birds become too stressed and sick to lay. Modern industrial farming equipment fails when exposed to volcanic ash contamination. Combines and tractors operating in ash-covered fields experience immediate engine failure as particles clog air intake systems and damage internal components. Irrigation systems across Nebraska's 8.3 million irrigated acres shut down as ash clogs sprinkler heads and damages pumps. Center pivot irrigation systems covering thousands of acres become inoperable as ash accumulation prevents proper rotation and water distribution. Grain storage facilities throughout the Midwest face immediate contamination as ash infiltrates silos and warehouses. The Port of New Orleans handles 60% of U.S. grain exports, shipping 2.4 billion bushels annually to international markets. Ash contamination makes stored grain unsuitable for consumption, creating massive losses even for crops harvested before the eruption. Elevator systems and conveyor belts jam as ash particles mix with grain, destroying stored commodities worth billions of dollars. Global food markets react immediately as agricultural devastation becomes apparent. China imports 36 million metric tons of American soybeans annually to feed its massive pork industry, but alternative suppliers lack capacity to replace this volume. Brazil's soybean production totals 154 million metric tons annually, but domestic consumption and existing export commitments leave insufficient surplus for emergency allocation. The global soybean shortage forces major protein production cuts, creating food shortages for over 1 billion people. Japan imports 15 million metric tons of American corn annually for livestock feed and food processing, representing 90% of its corn consumption. The volcanic disaster forces Japan to seek alternative suppliers, but global corn inventories beyond existing commitments remain limited. Competition for remaining supplies drives prices beyond the reach of developing nations, creating food security crises across regions where corn serves as a dietary staple for hundreds of millions of people. Food distribution networks collapse as transportation infrastructure fails under volcanic ash accumulation. Interstate highways carrying agricultural products from farm to market become impassable, stranding millions of tons of goods. Railroad lines critical for grain transport shut down as ash damages engines and clogs switching systems. Trucking companies lose thousands of vehicles as ash exposure destroys diesel engines, reducing transport capacity by massive percentages in affected regions. The agricultural devastation triggers a global food crisis affecting billions of people. International food aid organizations lack sufficient reserves to address shortages of this magnitude, as global emergency food stocks prove inadequate compared to lost American production. The collapse of America's agricultural output creates supply shortages that ripple through every sector of the global economy, setting the stage for unprecedented financial chaos as markets worldwide prepare in real time to absorb the stock market's worldwide react of this catastrophe as news of the eruption spreads through trading networks. The Dow Jones Industrial Average drops 1,200 points within the first hour as automated trading systems respond to breaking news algorithms. Historical precedent from a 1991 Mount Pinatubo eruption shows stock indices dropped approximately 5 to 6% following major volcanic events. But Yellowstone's proximity to critical economic infrastructure amplifies market fears. The S&P 500 experiences its largest single-day decline since the 2008 financial crisis as investors flee to safe haven assets. European markets open to immediate selling pressure as overnight developments create uncertainty about global supply chains. Circuit breakers activate across major exchanges as volatility reaches extreme levels. High-frequency trading systems amplify price swings as computer programs execute thousands of trades per second based on news sentiment analysis. The Nasdaq Composite Index faces severe pressure as technology companies dependent on global supply chains see their valuations collapse. Retirement accounts lose trillions in value as index funds tied to major market indicators experience massive outflows from panicked investors. The United States economy, valued at $27.3 trillion in 2025, faces immediate disruption as entire economic sectors shut down simultaneously. World Bank estimates suggest major volcanic eruptions can reduce global GDP by approximately 1%. But Yellowstone's impact on critical American infrastructure threatens far more severe economic contraction. Manufacturing output drops to zero in affected regions as factories close and supply chains break. The Federal Reserve activates emergency lending facilities, but traditional monetary policy tools prove inadequate against geological disasters of this magnitude. Commercial aviation revenues evaporate as volcanic ash makes flying impossible across North America. The 2010 Age of Geological eruption in Iceland grounded over 100,000 flights and paralyzed Europe's aviation network for 6 days, demonstrating how volcanic ash disrupts air travel on a continental scale. Delta Airlines cancels thousands of daily flights, losing millions in revenue while maintaining fixed costs for aircraft leases and employee salaries. American Airlines faces immediate operational shutdown as volcanic ash threatens their primary hub network. Boeing stock price collapses as orders for new aircraft disappear and existing delivery schedules become meaningless. Agricultural commodity markets experience unprecedented volatility as traders assess crop destruction across America's breadbasket. Corn futures spike dramatically as international buyers realize the scope of agricultural damage. Soybean prices increase sharply as global markets compete for limited supplies from alternative sources. The Chicago Mercantile Exchange implements emergency trading protocols, but legitimate hedging activity becomes nearly impossible under these extraordinary market conditions. Tourism revenues disappear overnight as international visitors cancel travel plans to North America. Las Vegas casinos close indefinitely as ash clouds approach Nevada, eliminating hundreds of thousands of jobs in the entertainment and hospitality sector. Disney World and Disneyland shut down operations, laying off massive numbers of employees as theme park attendance drops to zero. Cruise lines divert ships from North American ports, canceling thousands of bookings and refunding billions in prepaid vacation packages. Supply chains connecting East and West coasts face complete disruption as transportation networks collapse under volcanic ash accumulation. The Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach, which handle 40% of U.S. container imports worth $600 billion annually, close indefinitely as ash contaminates cargo handling equipment. Interstate 80, the primary trucking route across the continent, becomes impassable from California to Nebraska. Railroad networks carrying 1.7 billion tons of freight annually shut down as ash damages locomotives and clogs switching systems. Walmart's supply chain faces complete breakdown as trucking companies lose thousands of vehicles to ash damage. The company's 4,700 stores begin running out of essential goods within 72 hours as regional distribution centers go offline. Amazon suspends deliveries to affected states, eliminating billions in e-commerce revenue and affecting millions of Prime members who depend on regular deliveries. Banking systems strain under unprecedented withdrawal demands as customers attempt to access cash through ATM networks and branch locations. JP Morgan Chase processes withdrawal requests at 10 times normal volume as fear spreads through financial markets. Bank of America activates emergency protocols as customers empty accounts, fearing complete economic collapse. Regional banks in affected areas face immediate liquidity crises as their physical branches become inaccessible due to ash accumulation. Credit card processing networks crash under the volume of emergency purchases as people buy generators, food, and supplies. Visa and MasterCard systems experience outages as data centers lose power and communication links fail. Electronic payment systems that handle billions in daily transactions reduce to cash-only operations across multiple states. ATM networks run out of physical currency as armored car services can't navigate ash-covered roads to restock machines. Insurance companies face claims exceeding their combined reserves and reinsurance coverage. State Farm receives hundreds of thousands of claims within 48 hours, compared to normal daily volumes in the tens of thousands. Allstate's computer systems crash under the load of damage reports from volcanic ash exposure. Lloyd's of London activates catastrophe protocols, but the scale of losses exceeds anything in insurance industry history. International trade grinds to a halt as global supply chains collapse. Container ships carrying goods to North American ports divert to alternative destinations, but lack sufficient port capacity to handle the redirected volume. The Port Authority of New York and New Jersey processes emergency cargo diversions, but ash contamination threatens East Coast operations as the volcanic cloud spreads eastward. Currency markets react violently as the U.S. dollar loses significant value against the euro and Japanese yen within 48 hours. Foreign exchange reserves held by central banks worldwide lose trillions in value as dollar-denominated assets become questionable investments. The European Central Bank and Bank of Japan intervene in currency markets, but lack sufficient reserves to stabilize the falling dollar. The economic devastation creates immediate humanitarian pressures as millions of Americans face unemployment, homelessness, and resource scarcity. Emergency government spending requirements reach unprecedented levels as disaster relief, unemployment benefits, and economic stimulus programs activate simultaneously. The scale of displacement and economic disruption forces difficult decisions about resource allocation and population movement as entire regions become economically uninhabitable. The Great American Exodus. Mass population movements begin within hours as people flee the volcanic devastation, creating displacement patterns reminiscent of historical volcanic migrations. The 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia forced thousands to abandon their homes, while the Toba Supervolcano eruption 74,000 years ago triggered significant human migrations across Southeast Asia. Yellowstone's proximity to major population centers means millions of Americans face immediate displacement as ash clouds spread across the continent. The interstate highway system transforms into a massive evacuation corridor as people attempt to flee affected regions. Interstate 80 experiences unprecedented traffic volumes as vehicles stream eastward from Wyoming, Colorado, and Nebraska. Cars break down regularly as volcanic ash clogs air filters and damages engines, creating obstacles that block lanes for miles. Families abandon disabled vehicles and continue on foot when mechanical failures make driving impossible. Gas stations along major routes run out of fuel within hours as desperate travelers fill tanks and containers. Interstate 70 faces similar congestion as Denver residents evacuate eastward toward Kansas and Missouri. The highway becomes a slow-moving river of vehicles carrying everything people can pack in their cars. Rest stops overflow with families who sleep in parking lots when motels reach capacity. State police report hundreds of abandoned vehicles daily as ash exposure destroys engines and forces people to seek alternative transportation. Texas receives massive numbers of climate refugees as people flee south from affected states. The state's population increases dramatically within weeks, creating immediate housing shortages in major cities. Emergency shelters designed for hurricane evacuees quickly exceed capacity as refugee arrivals continue. The Texas National Guard establishes temporary camps in stadiums and convention centers, but these facilities accommodate only a fraction of arriving displaced persons. Florida experiences similar strain as people seek refuge in the state's metropolitan areas. Miami-Dade County's population swells rapidly as refugees arrive by car, bus, and plane. The county's emergency management systems prepare for hurricane evacuations that send people away from Florida, not massive influxes that strain local resources. Homeless encampments appear in parks as affordable housing becomes unavailable. Refugee settlements emerge across the southeastern United States as temporary shelters become long-term housing. Georgia establishes large camps outside Atlanta to house displaced families in military-style tents. These camps lack adequate sanitation facilities, with portable toilets serving far more people than recommended. Water distribution requires millions of gallons daily, but local infrastructure provides insufficient supply. Medical facilities treat hundreds of patients daily in tents designed for much smaller capacities. Alabama creates refugee settlements in Birmingham and Montgomery that house hundreds of thousands of people combined. These camps stretch across acres of hastily cleared land without proper drainage or waste management systems. Heavy rains turn campgrounds into muddy conditions that trap families in deteriorating situations. Food distribution becomes chaotic as supply trucks struggle to navigate improvised access roads. FEMA's disaster response capabilities face unprecedented demand that exceeds their planning scenarios. The agency maintains supplies for typical disaster scenarios, but confronts immediate need from millions of refugees. Emergency food supplies deplete rapidly as warehouses empty. FEMA's personnel struggle to coordinate relief efforts across multiple states simultaneously while managing refugee flows into receiving areas. The National Guard activates state organizations nationwide, deploying personnel to refugee management duties. Guard units establish checkpoints on major highways to direct refugee flows and prevent overcrowding in strained areas. Military police maintain order in refugee camps as resources become scarce and tensions rise. Medical units provide basic health care in field hospitals, but lack supplies to treat chronic conditions requiring prescription medications. Law enforcement agencies face breakdown as officers evacuate their own families from affected areas. Police departments lose significant personnel within hours of the eruption. Remaining officers struggle to maintain order as desperate people compete for scarce resources. Rural departments with small staffs suddenly patrol areas holding thousands of refugees. Canada opens its borders to American refugees, accepting displaced persons through crossings in Minnesota, North Dakota, and New York. The Canadian government activates emergency protocols, establishing processing centers in major cities. Canadian communities near the border experience rapid population increases as American families cross seeking safety. Provinces strain social services and housing availability beyond normal capacity. Mexico receives American refugees crossing through Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona border points. Mexican authorities waive normal visa requirements and establish temporary camps in border cities. Border city populations increase rapidly as Americans flee southward. Mexican military units assist in refugee processing and camp management, but lack resources for long-term settlement needs. European nations coordinate emergency refugee acceptance programs, with several countries agreeing to accept displaced Americans. Airlines arrange emergency evacuation flights from unaffected airports, but limited aircraft availability restricts daily passenger transport. Ships normally carrying cargo convert to passenger transport, ferrying refugees across the Atlantic in converted spaces. Social tensions rise in receiving communities as local residents compete with refugees for jobs, housing, and government services. Unemployment rates jump dramatically as displaced persons accept available work. Housing costs increase substantially as demand exceeds supply. Local school systems struggle to accommodate additional students without adequate classroom space or teachers. The demographic shift creates lasting changes across American regions. Habitable areas along the East Coast and Gulf states experience significant density increases, fundamentally altering their character. Cities double in size within months, requiring massive infrastructure expansion. Meanwhile, ash-contaminated interior regions become sparsely populated as residents relocate to safer areas. Communication networks strain under the massive coordination requirements as millions of displaced people seek information about safety, resources, and family members. Emergency services rely increasingly on technological systems to manage the unprecedented scale of human movement and coordinate relief efforts across multiple states and international borders. Technology's last stand. Modern technological infrastructure faces unprecedented challenges when volcanic ash clouds disrupt every system designed for normal atmospheric conditions. The United States Geological Survey operates the most sophisticated volcano monitoring network in the world at Yellowstone, with 47 seismometers detecting ground movement smaller than a human hair width and 15 GPS stations measuring surface deformation with millimeter precision. Dozens of thermal sensors track temperature changes of less than 1 degree Celsius across the caldera. This monitoring network processes 50,000 data points daily through automated systems that flag unusual patterns for immediate human review. The ASH 3D Tephra model represents the most advanced volcanic ash forecasting system available in 2025. This computer simulation uses three-dimensional wind field data that updates every 6 hours from global weather models. The system can predict ash distribution patterns across entire continents for eruptions lasting weeks or months. Unlike smaller volcanic eruptions, where wind patterns control ash movement, supervolcanic eruptions create umbrella clouds that spread ash in all directions regardless of prevailing winds. The model accounts for particle size distribution, atmospheric conditions, and eruption intensity to generate precise fallout maps that guide evacuation planning and emergency response coordination. INSAR satellite technology provides critical ground deformation measurements that reveal magma movement patterns beneath Yellowstone's surface. Interferometric synthetic aperture radar compares satellite images taken months apart to detect ground changes as small as a few millimeters across the entire caldera. These measurements help scientists understand how magma chambers expand and contract over time. Airborne LiDAR systems complement satellite data by creating detailed topographic maps that show surface changes with centimeter-level accuracy. These combined monitoring techniques provide the most comprehensive picture of volcanic activity ever achieved. Satellite communications become the primary lifeline connecting disaster zones to the outside world when terrestrial networks fail under ash accumulation. The Iridium satellite constellation maintains 66 active satellites in low Earth orbit, providing global coverage that operates independently of ground-based infrastructure. These satellites communicate through radio frequencies that penetrate volcanic ash clouds more effectively than cellular or internet signals. Emergency responders carry satellite phones capable of voice communication and data transmission even when cell towers collapse and fiber optic cables suffer damage. Social media platforms experience unprecedented usage spikes as survivors share real-time information about conditions in their areas. Twitter's infrastructure processes 6,000 tweets per second under normal conditions, but volcanic disaster coverage increases activity to 45,000 tweets per second. Facebook's data centers automatically scale server capacity to handle emergency traffic loads, but power outages in affected regions limit user access. Instagram becomes a primary source for visual documentation of ash fall patterns and evacuation routes, providing critical information to emergency management agencies. Power grid operators face impossible decisions about maintaining electrical service while protecting infrastructure from volcanic ash damage. The Western Interconnection electrical grid serves 71 million people across 14 states, but ash accumulation shorts out transmission lines and damages transformer equipment. Utility companies implement rolling blackouts to protect critical systems, but lose 60% of generating capacity within 48 hours of initial ash fall. Nuclear power plants activate emergency shutdown procedures as ash threatens cooling system intake filters and backup diesel generators. Cellular networks struggle to maintain service as ash accumulates on tower equipment and power systems fail across coverage areas. Verizon operates 70,000 cell towers nationwide, but loses 15,000 towers in the first week due to power outages and equipment damage. AT&T activates mobile cell towers mounted on trucks to restore service in refugee camps and emergency shelters. T-Mobile prioritizes emergency communications by limiting non-essential data usage and reserving bandwidth for first responders and disaster coordination. GPS navigation systems experience severe disruption as volcanic ash interferes with satellite signals and creates atmospheric anomalies. The global positioning system relies on precise timing signals from 31 satellites orbiting 12,550 miles above Earth, but ash particles in the upper atmosphere scatter and delay radio transmissions. Navigation accuracy decreases from the normal 3-meter precision to 50-meter uncertainty in affected areas. Emergency vehicles lose reliable navigation capabilities, forcing drivers to rely on paper maps and local knowledge to reach disaster sites. Unmanned aerial systems provide critical reconnaissance capabilities in areas too dangerous for human pilots to navigate. Military drones equipped with hardened electronics can operate in ash-contaminated airspace for limited periods before requiring engine maintenance. These aircraft carry multispectral imaging sensors that penetrate ash clouds to identify survivors and assess infrastructure damage. Real-time video feeds relay to emergency command centers, enabling coordinated search and rescue operations in conditions where manned aircraft cannot safely operate. Internet infrastructure demonstrates remarkable resilience through distributed architecture and redundant connections between major data centers. Cloud computing services automatically migrate critical applications to unaffected server farms when ash disrupts regional facilities. Amazon Web Services operates 84 availability zones worldwide, allowing seamless failover when volcanic ash disables data centers in affected regions. Content delivery networks cache emergency information at edge servers, ensuring fast access even when primary websites become unavailable. Amateur radio operators activate emergency networks that function independently of commercial communication systems. The Amateur Radio Emergency Service maintains 40,000 licensed operators trained in disaster communications protocols. These volunteers establish communication links between isolated communities and emergency management centers using high-frequency radio signals that propagate despite atmospheric interference. Digital packet radio systems relay text messages and basic data through networks that automatically route around failed stations. Emergency alert systems push critical information to mobile devices through multiple delivery channels that bypass normal cellular networks. The wireless emergency alert system reaches 95% of mobile phones through dedicated frequencies reserved for emergency communications. These messages include evacuation instructions, shelter locations, and safety warnings that update automatically based on changing conditions. The system operates independently of normal cellular traffic and continues functioning even when regular voice and data services become unavailable. Yet even the most sophisticated monitoring systems and communication networks cannot prevent the global catastrophe that follows when billions of tons of volcanic material enter Earth's atmosphere. The technological infrastructure that enables modern disaster response faces complete breakdown as the eruption's effects spread far beyond the immediate blast zone, triggering environmental changes that threaten the entire planet. Nuclear winter in the 21st century. Sulfur dioxide becomes the primary weapon in this atmospheric assault, with Yellowstone capable of injecting 2,500 times more sulfur compounds than Mount Pinatubo released in 1991. That eruption pumped 20 million tons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere and caused global temperatures to drop by 1.3 degrees Fahrenheit for several years. Yellowstone would release 50 billion tons of sulfur compounds, creating atmospheric conditions not experienced in recorded human history. The sulfur dioxide combines with water vapor at altitudes between 12 and 30 miles above Earth's surface, forming microscopic droplets of sulfuric acid that reflect sunlight back into space. These acid droplets create a planetary haze that blocks 15 to 25% of incoming solar radiation for years after the eruption. The particles remain suspended in the stratosphere because this atmospheric layer lacks the weather patterns that normally wash pollutants out of the lower atmosphere. Wind currents at these altitudes distribute the volcanic haze around the entire globe within 6 months, affecting regions thousands of miles from Yellowstone. The haze appears as a persistent milky white layer that dims the sun and creates spectacular red sunsets worldwide. Climate models using complex three-dimensional aerosol and sulfur chemistry schemes indicate global average temperatures would drop between 0.5 and 1 degree Celsius for 2 to 3 years following the eruption. While this cooling effect appears modest compared to ice age temperature changes, the rapid onset creates severe disruption to agricultural systems adapted to current climate conditions. The northern hemisphere experiences more pronounced cooling because most land masses sit north of the equator, and land surfaces cool faster than oceans. Europe faces temperature drops of 2 to 3 degrees Celsius during summer months, turning typical growing season weather into conditions resembling late autumn. Growing seasons shorten dramatically across the northern hemisphere as temperatures fall below the thresholds needed for crop development. Corn requires soil temperatures above 10 degrees Celsius for germination, but widespread regions would struggle to reach these temperatures during traditional planting seasons. Wheat needs 120 frost-free days to complete its growing cycle, but the volcanic winter would reduce frost-free periods significantly across major grain-producing regions. Rice cultivation in Asia depends on water temperatures between 20 and 35 degrees Celsius, but volcanic cooling would stress these temperature-sensitive crops. China's rice production feeds 1.4 billion people through multiple annual harvests in southern provinces, but volcanic winter would reduce yields substantially across growing seasons. The country's wheat belt across northern provinces would experience significant crop stress as temperatures remain below optimal ranges for plant development. India's agricultural system depends on predictable monsoon rains, but the volcanic haze disrupts atmospheric heating patterns that drive these critical weather systems. The Asian monsoon system delivers 80% of annual rainfall to regions housing 2.4 billion people. Volcanic particles in the stratosphere absorb heat that normally warms the Indian Ocean, weakening the temperature differential that creates monsoon winds. Rainfall decreases measurably across India, Bangladesh, and Southeast Asia during the years following the eruption. Rivers that support irrigation systems for hundreds of millions of farmers would experience reduced flow levels that stress agricultural production. Africa's agricultural regions face dual threats from reduced rainfall and lower temperatures that stress tropical crops adapted to consistent warmth. The Sahel region depends on seasonal rains that shift northward each year, but volcanic cooling disrupts these migration patterns. Farmers across Nigeria, Mali, and Burkina Faso would experience significant harvest reductions as rainfall becomes less predictable and temperatures drop below optimal ranges for millet, sorghum, and cassava production. South America's growing regions would experience less severe cooling due to their proximity to the equator, but still face agricultural disruption. Brazil's soybean production occurs during months that correspond to Northern Hemisphere winter, providing some protection from the worst volcanic effects. However, coffee plantations at higher elevations would suffer frost damage as temperatures drop below freezing at altitudes that normally remain warm year-round. Global food production would decline substantially within 2 years of the eruption as multiple growing seasons experience reduced yields across major agricultural regions. World grain reserves total approximately 600 million tons, enough to feed the global population for 75 days at current consumption levels. The volcanic winter would create significant shortages that persist for several years, even as growing conditions gradually return to normal. Food prices would increase dramatically as supplies become scarce and transportation costs rise due to fuel shortages. Developing nations that import substantial portions of their food supplies would face immediate hardship as international markets struggle to provide adequate volumes at affordable prices. Political instability would spread across regions where governments cannot adequately feed their populations, triggering mass migrations and regional conflicts over remaining agricultural resources. The climate disruption would persist for several years rather than the single-year effects seen from smaller volcanic eruptions. Sulfuric acid particles have average lifetimes of 2 to 3 years in the stratosphere, creating extended cooling periods. Ocean temperatures take years to recover from atmospheric cooling, creating feedback effects that prolong the volcanic winter beyond the direct atmospheric impacts. Developing nations would face severe challenges as their agricultural systems experience stress and social structures strain under resource scarcity. Sub-Saharan Africa would experience significant population pressure within years as food production drops below normal levels. Southeast Asian nations dependent on rice cultivation would face similar challenges as their primary food source becomes less reliable. Competition for remaining arable land would create tensions between nations seeking to secure food production for their populations. Water resources would become increasingly valuable as reduced rainfall makes irrigation more essential for agricultural production. Countries with significant grain reserves would likely restrict exports to preserve domestic supplies, creating international tensions over food distribution. The volcanic winter would stress human civilization as population levels adjust to reduced agricultural capacity under the altered climate conditions. Modern interconnected economies would amplify the volcanic winter effects as global supply chains experience disruption and international trade systems face breakdown. The 2025 global population of 8 billion people depends on industrial agriculture and international food distribution networks that would struggle under volcanic winter conditions. Yet humanity has faced similar challenges before, and the archaeological record reveals both the devastating impacts and remarkable resilience that define
Lessons
our species
from the
response
ancient past
to catastrophic
historical
volcanic eruptions
throughout history
provide crucial insights into how catastrophic events reshape human civilization and reveal patterns that help predict future impacts. The 1991 Mount Pinatubo eruption in the Philippines offers the most relevant modern comparison for understanding supervolcanic effects. This eruption injected 20 million tons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, causing global temperatures to drop by approximately 0.7 degrees Celsius for 3 years. The cooling effect disrupted agricultural production worldwide, demonstrating how even moderate volcanic events create far-reaching consequences for food systems and economic stability. Mount Tambora's 1815 eruption provides another critical example of volcanic disaster reshaping human society. The eruption in Indonesia released 56 teragrams of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, causing global temperatures to drop by 0.8 degrees Celsius. The year 1816 became known as the year without a summer as crops failed across Europe, North America, and China. Snow fell in June across New England, and frost killed crops throughout the growing season. Ireland experienced its worst famine since the medieval period as potato harvests failed completely. The Tambora disaster triggered massive migrations as people fled regions where agriculture became impossible. New England farmers abandoned their land and moved west to Ohio and Indiana, accelerating American westward expansion. European populations migrated from affected rural areas to cities, speeding up urbanization processes that were already underway. The crisis also sparked innovations in food preservation and transportation as societies adapted to unreliable harvests. Emergency food distribution systems developed during this period became models for disaster relief programs still used today. Archaeological excavations reveal how ancient civilizations responded to volcanic catastrophes through technological and social adaptations. Sites in Guatemala show that Maya populations abandoned cities after volcanic eruptions, then returned decades later with new building techniques designed to resist ash accumulation. Roman settlements near Mount Vesuvius developed architectural features like sloped roofs and reinforced foundations after experiencing repeated ash falls. These adaptations show how human societies learned from volcanic disasters and modified their technologies accordingly. Archaeological evidence demonstrates both the fragility and resilience of ancient civilizations facing volcanic disasters. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC coincided with increased volcanic activity in the Mediterranean region, suggesting that environmental stress contributed to societal breakdown. However, other civilizations like the Minoans survived multiple volcanic eruptions by developing trade networks that provided alternative food sources when local agriculture failed. Their maritime culture allowed them to import grain from Egypt and other regions during volcanic winters. Modern humans might face greater vulnerability to supervolcanic eruptions than our ancestors due to increased population density and technological dependence. Ancient hunter-gatherer societies could move to new territories when environmental conditions changed, but modern cities concentrate millions of people in areas that become uninhabitable during volcanic disasters. However, modern technology provides advantages that ancient peoples lacked, including global communication networks, international food distribution systems, and scientific monitoring that provides advance warning of volcanic threats. Historical volcanic eruptions changed political boundaries and power structures as some regions became uninhabitable while others remained productive. The Tambora eruption shifted global trade patterns as traditional agricultural exporters lost their production capacity and new regions emerged as food suppliers. political instability followed agricultural collapse in affected areas, leading to government changes and social revolutions. The Irish potato famine following Tambora contributed to political movements that eventually led to Irish independence. The 2010 Age of Geological eruption in Iceland demonstrates how even small volcanic events can disrupt modern global systems. The eruption grounded over 100,000 flights and paralyzed European aviation for 6 days, showing how interconnected transportation networks create vulnerabilities that ancient civilizations never faced. Agricultural produce rotted in warehouses as cargo flights couldn't reach their destinations, affecting farmers thousands of miles from the eruption site. This modern example reveals how volcanic ash clouds can trigger economic damage far exceeding the direct physical destruction. Recent eruptions like Mount Pinatubo in 2025 and Canlayan Volcano in 2024 to 2025 provide ongoing reminders of volcanic threats to modern populations. These events displaced thousands of people and disrupted agricultural production across wide areas, demonstrating that volcanic disasters remain active threats requiring constant monitoring and preparedness. The immediate evacuation responses to these eruptions show both the advantages of modern communication systems and the continuing challenges of moving large populations quickly during volcanic emergencies. Studying supervolcanic cycles reveals that these events follow predictable patterns of magma accumulation, eruption, and caldera formation over geological timescales. The accumulation of huge magma volumes results in supereruptions that cause crustal collapse and caldera formation, followed by periods of relative quiet until fresh magma arrives and causes uplift. Understanding these cycles helps scientists predict future eruptions and provides insights into the long-term volcanic threats facing human civilization. The historical record shows that societies can survive catastrophic volcanic events, but recovery requires fundamental changes in how civilizations organize themselves. Successful adaptation depends on maintaining diverse resource bases, developing flexible social structures, and preserving knowledge systems that enable rapid technological innovation. The civilizations that survived major volcanic disasters shared common characteristics, including strong trade networks, decentralized food production, and cultural practices that emphasized community cooperation during crises. These lessons from ancient volcanic disasters reveal both the devastating short-term impacts and the extraordinary human capacity for adaptation over longer time frames. While the immediate aftermath of a supervolcanic eruption creates unprecedented challenges, history demonstrates that human societies possess remarkable abilities to rebuild and reorganize in response to catastrophic environmental changes. The question becomes not whether recovery is possible, but rather how long such massive reconstruction efforts would require and what forms they might take. The road to recovery. Recovery efforts would begin immediately, but stretch across multiple decades as the scale of destruction exceeds anything in modern disaster management experience. The 1991 Mount Pinatubo eruption required 4 years for atmospheric recovery and demonstrated that volcanic disasters create long-term challenges extending far beyond initial cleanup efforts. Soil recovery from Pinatubo ash took 10 to 20 years in affected agricultural regions. But Yellowstone's proximity to major population centers and agricultural areas would create contamination problems requiring sustained remediation efforts. Transportation networks across affected states would need complete reconstruction rather than simple repair, while power grids would require total replacement in regions receiving heavy ash deposits. International cooperation would determine whether America survives as a functioning nation or fragments into regional territories managed through external assistance. Canada would need to absorb millions of American refugees, fundamentally changing Canadian demographics and political structure. Mexico would face similar pressures, housing displaced Americans along its northern border. European Union nations would coordinate extensive refugee resettlement programs, accepting displaced Americans across member countries. These arrangements would extend for years as ash contamination makes return impossible for most evacuees from heavily affected regions. The European Space Agency would coordinate satellite monitoring of contamination levels across North America, providing data that American agencies could no longer collect due to infrastructure collapse. China would likely establish agricultural research stations in unaffected American regions, developing crops capable of growing in volcanic soil conditions. Japan's experience with volcanic ash from Mount Sakurajima would prove invaluable, as Japanese engineers understand concrete production using volcanic materials and agricultural techniques for ash-contaminated fields. Reconstruction would require relocating tens of millions of Americans from contaminated regions to areas along the eastern seaboard and Gulf Coast. This represents one of the largest planned migrations in human history, creating massive demographic shifts across the continent. New communities would emerge in Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas designed specifically for displaced populations. These settlements would need thousands of new schools, hundreds of hospitals, and extensive road networks connecting previously rural areas transformed into population centers. The reconstruction would consume substantial portions of global construction materials as new infrastructure replaces destroyed systems. Steel and concrete requirements would strain international production capacity, forcing coordination between supplier nations. China would need to increase production, specifically for American reconstruction efforts. Building materials would become strategic resources, requiring international treaties and allocation agreements between nations capable of meeting demand. Agriculture would relocate from traditional growing regions to areas with minimal ash contamination. Vermont and New Hampshire would become significant agricultural states as farmers establish operations in previously marginal farmland. The Pacific Northwest would expand agricultural production despite ash deposits because existing infrastructure and climate conditions support intensive farming. Florida would increase agricultural output through vertical farming installations and greenhouse complexes designed for refugee populations. Soil scientists would develop new techniques combining biological remediation with engineered microorganisms designed to break down volcanic compounds. These systems would process ash-contaminated soil faster than natural weathering processes. Modified bacteria would convert toxic compounds into harmless minerals, but the process would still require years per treatment cycle. Large-scale soil processing operations would treat millions of tons of contaminated earth through specialized facilities. Volcanic ash would become a construction material as engineers develop concrete formulations using processed ash as aggregate. Research shows volcanic ash concrete achieves higher strength than traditional materials while reducing cement requirements. This technology would transform millions of tons of volcanic debris from waste into valuable construction resources. New building codes would require volcanic ash concrete in reconstruction projects to utilize available materials efficiently. Population centers would permanently relocate as contaminated regions become unsuitable for human settlement. Denver would cease functioning as a major metropolitan area, with residents scattered across receiving communities. Salt Lake City would close due to toxic ash accumulation in the Valley Basin that natural processes cannot remove. Other cities would become monitoring stations maintained by automated systems tracking contamination levels for future cleanup efforts. The eastern seaboard would experience rapid urbanization comparable to major development projects worldwide. Charlotte would grow dramatically within years as refugees arrive. Jacksonville would expand substantially as Florida becomes a primary destination for internal migration. These cities would require entirely new infrastructure systems designed for populations several times their original size. Economic rebuilding would create new industries focused on environmental remediation and disaster management. Companies specializing in ash removal equipment would generate substantial revenue. Soil treatment facilities would become major employers in affected regions. Agricultural technology companies would develop specialized equipment for farming in volcanic conditions, creating export opportunities as other nations prepare for similar disasters. The American economy would shift toward primary resource extraction and environmental engineering. Mining operations would expand to provide materials for reconstruction efforts. Forestry would become strategically important as would replaces other materials in certain applications due to shortages. Fishing industries would expand along coastal areas as protein sources shift away from traditional livestock regions. Psychological recovery would require establishing new mental health systems designed for mass trauma treatment. Professional organizations would need to train additional therapists specializing in disaster-related disorders. Community support programs would operate for decades as multiple generations process the trauma of displacement. Children affected by the disaster would require specialized educational programs addressing their unique needs. Innovation would accelerate as survival requirements drive technological development. Atmospheric processing systems would advance beyond current capabilities as communities require air purification technology. Water treatment advances would revolutionize municipal systems globally as engineers develop techniques for processing volcanic contamination. Agricultural automation would expand rapidly as labor shortages forced mechanization of food production systems. America would emerge as a fundamentally different nation organized around environmental resilience and disaster preparedness. The shared experience of survival would create stronger social institutions and cooperative frameworks. International relationships would deepen through continued dependence on global support systems. This transformation would reveal both the fragility of modern civilization and humanity's remarkable capacity for adaptation when facing existential challenges. The monitoring systems tracking Yellowstone's magma chamber represent humanity's best defense against geological uncertainty. The United States Geological Survey calculates eruption odds at 1 in 730,000 annually. But continuous surveillance reduces our vulnerability to this low probability, high impact threat. Advanced seismic networks, GPS stations, and atmospheric modeling provide early warning capabilities that previous generations never possessed. This scenario exposes our species' fundamental vulnerability to geological forces while demonstrating our remarkable capacity for international cooperation and technological adaptation. Modern interconnected systems amplify both our risks and our recovery capabilities compared to ancient populations who survived similar disasters. Supporting USGS monitoring programs and developing comprehensive preparedness plans represents our most practical response to supervolcanic threats. These scientific efforts provide the foundation for survival strategies that could preserve human civilization when geological forces beyond our control reshape the planet.